The year was 1865, and the frontier was a place where men bled, where the land itself seemed to chew at your bones and spit you out. Jack Harlan had learned this lesson the hard way. The stony hills and endless plains of the Western Territories held no mercy, no promises, only the sharp tang of dust and the sting of loneliness. There was no law here but the law of survival, and Jack had long since stopped believing in anything else. The past was dead, buried under the weight of a grief that had settled deep in his bones. He had sworn it, sworn that he would never love again. Not after Sarah. Not after the ambush that took her life and shredded what was left of his soul. He could still feel her laughter in the wind, see the light in her eyes when she spoke of their future together. But those memories were as fragile as a half-burnt letter, disappearing with the first gust of wind. Now, all he had left was a ranch on the edge of Hollow Creek, a place that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. Jack had learned how to live with the ghosts of the past, but he never allowed himself to think of the future until she came riding into his life. It was late afternoon when the woman appeared. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parched earth. Jack was at the local watering hole, nursing a whiskey that tasted like fire and regret. The saloon was a low, wooden structure, its walls darkened by the years of smoke and grime. A few men were scattered about, some hunched over their drinks, others arguing in low, gravelly voices. Jack paid them no mind. He never did. But then the door creaked open, and the silence fell like a thick blanket over the room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the orange glow of the setting sun. Her figure was lean, hard, and she moved with the kind of confidence that belonged to someone who had lived through more than her fair share of trouble. Her eyes, dark, steady, swept over the room, and when they landed on Jack, something inside him twisted. There was no softness there, no hesitation. She wasn't the kind of woman to seek refuge in a place like this. The men in the room didn't seem to know what to make of her. A few shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, but none had the courage to speak. It was a rare thing, a woman walking into a town like Hollow Creek, and even rarer for one to command attention without so much as a word. She strode forward, her boots scraping against the floorboards, and Jack couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about the way she held herself, like she didn't belong, and yet, at the same time, like she belonged more than anyone else in the room. She was wearing a faded brown coat, the kind of clothing that told stories of long rides through the open plains of dust and rain and everything in between. Her face was sharp, determined, and when she reached the bar, she didn't wait for anyone to offer her a seat. She just claimed one. The bartender, a man named Hank who had seen more than his fair share of strange faces, grunted in her direction. "What'll it be?" "Whiskey," she said, her voice low but clear, "and don't make it weak." Jack watched her from the corner of his eye. There was something about her that set his teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way she had appeared out of nowhere, or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in years he felt something stirring inside him that wasn't a memory or a regret. He didn't want to feel it. He had made that vow. He had buried everything that could make him feel alive. But something in the woman's quiet defiance, in the way she carried herself like a weapon waiting to be drawn, made him wonder if he had made a mistake. He took a slow drink from his glass, feeling the burn as it slid down his throat, and then turned back to the woman. She hadn't noticed him yet, but Jack knew that wouldn't last long. The place was too small, too cramped. There was no escaping a stranger once they set foot in Hollow Creek. The moments stretched into minutes, the only sound the clink of glass and the occasional cough from one of the men at the table. Jack's mind wandered, the images of his past flickering like ghosts in the corners of his vision. He thought of Sarah again, her laugh, her touch, the way she had believed in him when no one else did. But that was all gone now. That was in the past, and the past had no place in the present. He couldn't afford to let it. But just as he was about to push the memories aside, he heard her voice again, sharper this time. "You, Harlan." Jack's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he was back in that nightmarish world of gunfire and blood, back to the moment when everything he had known had crumbled. But when he looked up, the woman was staring at him, unblinking, unwavering, and it hit him that she wasn't here for trouble. Not yet, anyway. That's me, he replied, his voice rough from too many years of silence. He didn't know why he answered her, but something in her presence made the words spill out, and before he could stop them, he found himself meeting her gaze. There was a challenge in her eyes, a test, and he wasn't sure yet whether he wanted to pass or fail. She didn't smile. In fact, her expression didn't change at all. "I'm looking for a man," she said, her voice steady. "A man who might know something about the bandits near Three Forks." Jack's brow furrowed. He had heard rumors about the gang that had been terrorizing the region, outlaws with no loyalty but to themselves, men who lived fast and died young. They were a threat, and anyone who got too close to them often ended up buried in the desert. But why was she asking him? The question lingered in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken things. "You're asking the wrong man," Jack said, his voice low. "I've got no use for trouble, and I've got no use for bandits. If you're looking for someone to go on some wild hunt, you've got the wrong town." She studied him for a long moment, as though weighing his words. "Funny," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of something almost like amusement, "because I think you've been waiting for trouble your whole life." Jack stiffened at the observation. He wasn't used to being read so easily, not by a stranger, not by anyone. He had learned long ago to mask his thoughts behind walls of indifference, to become invisible in a world that had no patience for weakness. But there is something about the woman that seemed to peel away those walls, piece by piece. He didn't answer her right away. Instead, he took another drink, letting the whiskey burn through him again. The silence stretched between them, taut and uncomfortable, until she finally spoke again. "Maybe you don't have to go looking for trouble," she said quietly. "Maybe it finds you." Jack turned his head sharply at her words. He could see now that she wasn't just talking about the outlaws. She was talking about something deeper, something unspoken, something that had haunted him for years. The weight of her gaze was suffocating, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he was on the edge of something he didn't know if he was ready for. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice a little more forceful than he intended. But she didn't flinch. She just kept looking at him, like she knew exactly what he was running from. "No," she said, her voice soft, almost pitying. "But I'm starting to think you don't know anything about yourself either." And with that, she turned, leaving him standing there, dumbstruck, the echoes of her words reverberating in his chest. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a warning. The door swung shut behind her, and the room felt empty, even though it was still full of men. Jack knew one thing for sure. This woman was trouble. And trouble had a way of changing everything. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes as Jack sat there, his mind racing. He had no idea what brought her to Hollow Creek, or what it was about her that made his blood stir. But he had the uneasy feeling that his life was about to take a turn he couldn't control. He didn't want to care. He didn't want to feel anything. But it was too late. Something had been awakened, and Jack Harlan knew there was no going back. Jack hadn't meant to follow her. He had no intention of chasing after the woman who had stirred something in him, something he had buried long ago. But when the sun dipped low over the mountains and the shadows grew long across the town of Hollow Creek, Jack found himself standing at the edge of town, staring at the path she had taken. She hadn't looked back. She had simply ridden off, her silhouette swallowed up by the dusk. And yet, something tugged at him, a pull stronger than any reason. For a long while, he stood there, watching the emptiness of the road, the sound of crickets rising in the quiet. The wind shifted, kicking up dust, and Jack's hand instinctively went to the grip of his revolver. He'd learned the hard way that nothing good ever came without a price out here. And a woman like her, riding alone at dusk, didn't just get lost. She was either running from something, or she was looking for trouble. A sudden rustle behind him broke his thoughts, and Jack turned to see two men from the saloon stumbling out, drunk and laughing, their voices rising in a braying chorus. "Look at that, Harlan," one of them shouted, his voice slurred. "Looks like you found yourself a lady friend." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. His reputation spoke for itself. He wasn't a man who went looking for company, least of all in places like this. but there was a hard edge to the way the men looked at him, like they were trying to provoke something. Jack's jaw tightened. The air felt thick with tension, but he didn't react. He never did. Not anymore. With a grunt, he turned on his heel and headed toward his horse. It wasn't until he was halfway to the stables that he felt the first ripple of unease settle deep in his gut. The men had stopped laughing. Jack didn't look back. He didn't need to. As he saddled up, the barn door creaked open behind him. Without turning, he knew it was her. The woman. Eliza. She had come back, and now she was standing in the open doorway, watching him. "What do you want, lady?" Jack asked, his voice low and strained, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to the ache that had started clawing at his chest again. "I'm not here for you, Harlan," she said, her tone as flat as the desert plains. "I'm here for something else." Jack kept his eyes on his horse, but he could feel her presence like a heat. "And what's that?" "You're still asking the wrong questions," she said, taking a step forward. "But that's all right. I'll give you time." She stepped into the barn, the sound of her boots muffled by the straw scattered across the floor. The dim light from the lanterns flickered as she approached, and Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to care. But here she was, this woman who had no business in his life, pulling at something he thought was long dead. "You're heading toward Three Forks, aren't you?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but sharp. The question hung in the air like a noose. Jack's eyes flickered to hers, and he saw that same fire in her gaze, the fire of someone who had seen more than their share of suffering and wasn't afraid to face it head on. For a moment, the world around him felt muffled, distant, and all he could see was her. Just her. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though the lie felt like ash in his mouth. Three Forks wasn't far off, and Jack had heard the rumors. Whispers about a group of outlaws, a gang that had been taking over the territory, setting fires to homesteads, stealing from the ranchers, and leaving nothing but a trail of blood and broken lives behind them. He had hoped to avoid them. But now it seemed like they were closer than he had realized. "I know you've been to the edge of that land," she pressed, taking another step toward him, her eyes narrowing. "You've seen what they've left in their wake." Jack's stomach twisted, and he turned away, gripping the saddle as if it might steady him. He wasn't ready for this. Not for her. Not for whatever pull she had on him. But it was too late now. The words had already been spoken, and there was a weight to them, something inevitable. "I don't want anything to do with that mess," Jack said, his voice cold, final. "You're wasting your time." She didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for your help, Harlan. I'm telling you what's coming. The outlaws are headed this way, and I'm going after them, whether you like it or not." For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the wind that whistled through the cracks in the barn. Jack could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. Her determination was a heavy thing, and it was starting to smother the anger that had bubbled to the surface. He wasn't used to being pushed like this. But then again, he hadn't been used to much in years. "And what makes you think I care what you do?" Jack asked, his voice hard, a last-ditch effort to hold on to whatever stubbornness was left in him. Eliza tilted her head, her gaze fixed on him, and for the first time, Jack saw something like pity in her eyes. "I don't think you care. Not yet, but you will." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. "I'm leaving at dawn," she called over her shoulder. "I suggest you make up your mind before then." Jack stood there in the barn, alone, the scent of horses and hay thick in the air. He wanted to turn away, to ignore it, but something gnawed at him, and he knew it wasn't just about the outlaws. It was about her, this woman who had walked into his life without asking permission and had somehow turned everything upside down. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Jack found himself in the stables, saddling his horse. He hadn't intended to follow her. He hadn't intended to get involved. But his feet had carried him to the barn, and his hands had gone through the motions without him having to think. She had been right. He had been waiting for trouble. His whole life had been waiting for something to shake him awake, something to remind him that there was still a world beyond the ranch, beyond the grief. And Eliza, whether she knew it or not, was the thing that had dragged him out of the hole he'd dug for himself. When he rode out of the barn, Eliza was already there, her back to him, her horse tethered to a post, ready to go. She didn't turn as he approached, but he could feel her awareness, as if she had sensed him the moment he entered the clearing. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm about to break. "I'm not here to rescue you," Jack said, his voice gruff, as he pulled his horse alongside hers. Eliza's lips twitched, though she didn't smile. "Didn't ask for a rescue," she said simply, her voice carrying a hardness that Jack knew all too well. She looked up at him, eyes sharp. "You're here because you know what's coming. You're here because you don't know how to walk away." Jack's throat tightened. She was right. He had known it the moment she had looked at him in the saloon. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but he couldn't deny it anymore. He had walked away from love, from life, from everything. But the one thing he couldn't walk away from was this, the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something left worth fighting for. "I'm not doing this for you," Jack said, his voice low, eyes locked on the horizon. "But I'm not about to leave you out there alone either." Her gaze softened just a fraction. "Didn't think you would." And with that, they both turned their horses toward the open trail, the dust rising behind them as they rode into the unknown. The ride was long and unforgiving. Dust clung to their clothes and skin. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the silence between Jack and Eliza stretched like an old rope pulled too tight. They had ridden out from Hollow Creek at dawn, but already the hours felt like days. The wilderness around them was wild and uncaring, an endless stretch of hills, dry grasses, and jagged rocks. The wind howled through the cracks in the mountains, carrying with it the scent of earth, iron, and something else, something darker. Jack rode beside her, keeping his distance, though he felt the weight of her presence like a shadow always just behind him. He hadn't asked her what she was running from, and she hadn't volunteered the information. That was fine with him. The less he knew, the better. But there was something about the way she moved, her precise, efficient manner of guiding her horse over rough terrain, that told him she wasn't just another woman in trouble. She was something else entirely. She was a survivor. And maybe, just maybe, that was why she had dragged him into this mess. They had reached the foothills of Three Forks by midday, and the wind had begun to shift, carrying with it the promise of rain. Jack squinted into the horizon, where the faint outline of the mountains loomed like a jagged set of teeth. He could feel the tension in the air, thickening with every mile they covered. Eliza didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were like sharp-edged stones. "There's a pass through those mountains," she said, her voice low, as though weighing each word before letting it fall into the space between them. "It'll take us straight into their camp." "Too easy," Jack muttered, glancing toward the pass she indicated. It was a narrow, winding gap in the jagged rock, barely wide enough for two horses to ride side by side. It was the kind of place an outlaw gang would use to hide in plain sight, isolated, defensible, and easy to ambush anyone foolish enough to enter. "Nothing's easy out here," she replied with a shrug, her eyes never leaving the path ahead. "But it's the quickest way. They won't be expecting anyone." Jack wasn't so sure about that. He had heard whispers about the gang that controlled the area, men who had a taste for violence and a habit of getting what they wanted no matter the cost. These weren't the kind of men who would leave a clear trail. They would be watching, waiting for anyone stupid enough to stumble into their territory. "You know, they're going to be ready for us," Jack said, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. "They'll be watching every move." She glanced over at him then, her eyes narrowing, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "That's why we're not going in straight. We'll take the long way around." Jack's brow furrowed. "The long way?" "You're going to have to trust me, Harlan," she said, the smile fading as quickly as it had appeared. "I've been tracking these bastards longer than you've been alive. I know their patterns. I know how they think." Jack didn't like it. He didn't like the idea of walking blindly into a trap, even if Eliza thought she had the upper hand. But he also knew he had no choice. The outlaws had to be stopped. This wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving anyone who lived anywhere near Three Forks, and maybe, just maybe, it was about finding some redemption for himself. "Fine," he said, tightening his grip on the reins. "We'll do it your way." The terrain grew rougher as they continued westward, the rocks beneath their horses' hooves scraping harshly against the earth. They rode in silence for hours, the only sound the soft thud of hooves and the occasional crack of a distant branch breaking under the weight of the wind. Jack's mind drifted, memories resurfacing like ripples in a still pond. He thought of Sarah, her laugh, her touch. He thought of the day the gang had come through, their guns drawn and their eyes cold, the fire that had consumed his ranch, and the way the flames had felt like a cleansing, even though it had been a destruction. And then there was Eliza. She was so damn different from Sarah. She wasn't soft. She wasn't warm. But she had something that Jack couldn't quite name. Strength, maybe. Something that drew him in, even though he didn't want it. Something that made him think that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to be more than the man he'd become. He glanced over at her. Her eyes were scanning the land ahead, her body stiff and alert. She was the picture of focus, her posture rigid with concentration. He wondered what it was that had made her this way, what kind of life she had lived before this. He thought about asking, but the words stuck in his throat. Some questions weren't meant to be asked. They stopped for the night in a small ravine, sheltered from the wind and the cold that had started to seep into the air. Jack built a fire while Eliza unpacked their supplies. They didn't speak much, but the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt inevitable, like the calm before the storm. Eliza unrolled her bedroll and settled on the ground, stretching her long limbs with a practiced ease. She looked up at the stars, her eyes narrowing slightly. Jack watched her for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "You've done this before," he said, the question hanging in the air like smoke. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her rifle, checking it with the kind of care that made Jack realize just how much she trusted her own instincts. "I have," she said, her voice distant, "and I don't make mistakes." Jack let the silence settle again, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. He didn't know what it was about her, but he felt like he was on the edge of something. He didn't know what exactly, but it felt dangerous, and he wasn't sure if that was a feeling he wanted to chase or one he needed to run from. The night passed slowly. The moon rose high above the ravine, casting long shadows across the rocky walls. Jack kept watch for a while, but the hours stretched on, and the silence of the desert pressed down on him, suffocating and vast. He found it hard to breathe, sometimes, hard to remember who he was and what he had been before the darkness took over. But that wasn't the man he needed to be right now. Not here, not with Eliza. Right now, he was just another man on a mission, trying to stay alive long enough to do what was necessary. The next morning, they were on the move again. The sun rose behind them, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. Eliza led the way, her eyes sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Jack followed, his instincts on edge, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. They were close now, close to the pass that would take them into the heart of the gang's territory. And then, as if the land itself had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole, the first sign of danger appeared. A shot rang out, sharp and unmistakable, followed by the sound of hooves thundering down the trail. Jack's heart slammed against his chest, and he instinctively reached for his gun. But before he could even draw, Eliza had already wheeled her horse around, her rifle raised and aimed with deadly precision. "Get down," she shouted, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped to the ground, flattening himself against the dusty earth as the first wave of riders appeared, 6 men on horseback, their faces obscured by the dust and the wind, but their weapons drawn and ready. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears, and for the first time since they had started this journey, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't thinking about Sarah or the ranch or the mistakes he'd made. He was thinking about survival, about making it through this. And as the gunfire erupted around them, he knew that this was only the beginning. The gang was here. The reckoning had come. But Jack wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The sound of hooves was deafening. Jack barely had time to register the gunfire before he was up and moving, his hands reaching for his revolver with a practiced, fluid motion. His body felt like it was moving of its own accord, instinct taking over as the first rider came into view. The man was wild-eyed and grim, his face twisted with something between rage and fear. He didn't slow his horse, didn't hesitate. He fired, the shot ringing out like the crack of thunder in the still morning air. Jack dove to the side, rolling on the dusty ground, the bullet tearing through the air just above him. He came up with a grunt, firing back before his feet were even under him. The shot hit the rider in the shoulder, sending him sprawling off his horse with a screech. Eliza's rifle barked next to him, sharp and true. One of the riders dropped from his saddle, a thin plume of red marking the place where he'd been standing a moment before. She moved with a grace Jack had only ever seen in those who had lived by the gun. She didn't waste a breath, didn't waste a movement. Her eyes were cold, calculating. "We need to move," she shouted, already gathering the reins of her horse and yanking it toward the brush. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He was on his feet, his mind already calculating their next move. 6 riders, maybe more. Eliza had taken out 2, but that still left at least for closing in fast. They'd been cornered at the edge of a narrow ridge that fed into the pass. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They had to fight or they had to make a stand. Down the ravine, Jack called out, his voice sharp with urgency. Eliza nodded without question. She turned her horse and kicked it into motion, racing toward the steep descent of the ravine. Jack followed close behind, keeping his eyes on the men who were charging after them, their horses pounding the earth with every desperate stride. The ravine was treacherous, the ground uneven and the rocks jagged, but it was their only chance. They needed cover, and this was the only place they could find it in time. The walls of the ravine were too narrow for the riders to charge in full force. They'd be slowed down, and Jack knew they could use that. But it wasn't just about the terrain. It was about timing, about keeping their distance long enough to gain an advantage. Jack's heart was hammering in his chest as he whipped his horse forward, forcing it to push harder, faster. The sound of pursuit was still there, louder now as the riders followed, their calls angry, frantic. The wind kicked up behind them, carrying the scent of sweat and blood. He glanced over at Eliza. She was ahead of him now, her silhouette outlined against the narrow mouth of the ravine. Her face was set, her expression unreadable, but there was something in the way she rode, the way she fought, something that told Jack she was no stranger to this kind of battle. Eliza glanced over her shoulder, eyes narrowing. "They're too close. We have to get a better position." Jack nodded, already making a hard turn up ahead, toward a cluster of rocks that would give them a brief respite. They didn't have time for a plan. They needed a miracle. The first rider was nearly on them, his horse galloping like a freight train, his gun raised, ready to shoot. Jack didn't hesitate. He swung his revolver up and fired in one smooth motion. The shot took the man in the chest, sending him toppling from his horse in a spray of dust and blood. But the others didn't slow. They came on, one after the other. They reached the rocks just in time. Eliza's horse skidded to a halt, and she leapt from the saddle in a fluid motion, hitting the ground and rolling into cover behind a large boulder. Jack followed, barely avoiding the spray of bullets that followed him. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the crackling tension of the moment. The riders had stopped for a brief moment, their horses kicking up the earth, as they tried to figure out their next move. Jack crouched low, using the boulder as cover. His heart was still racing, but his mind was clear. "Can you see them?" he whispered, his voice low, controlled. Eliza nodded, her eyes scanning the ridge above them. 2, maybe 3 more. "They're trying to flank us." Jack cursed under his breath. They had no time, no space. They had to act fast. "Take the left side," he said. "I'll cover the right." Eliza didn't argue. She slipped out from behind the rock, moving like a shadow, her rifle raised, her posture calm but alert. Jack kept his eyes trained on the other side, his hand tight on his gun. A few tense moments passed, the air thick with anticipation. Jack's heart thudded in his chest, each beat like a countdown to something inevitable. And then from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A flash of dust, the gleam of a rifle barrel catching the low sun. He fired without thinking, his aim true. The first rider went down, his body jerking violently before he slumped lifeless from his saddle. But there was no time to savor the victory. Another rider appeared, charging toward them with the ferocity of a wild animal. This one didn't hesitate. He had murder in his eyes, his face twisted with rage as he aimed his rifle straight at Jack. Jack had only a split second to react. His hand moved almost before his brain registered the threat, his gun coming up in a blur of motion. The rider fired first, the shot ringing out with a deafening crack. Jack felt the bullet graze his arm, the sting sharp, but he didn't flinch. His own shot rang true, taking the rider down before he could pull the trigger again. Jack didn't pause to catch his breath. He had no time to celebrate. He moved quickly, eyes scanning the ridge for any other movement. "Eliza," he shouted, his voice carried across the ravine. She didn't respond immediately, but he heard the quick, steady crack of her rifle from the left side. The final rider appeared, trying to circle around them, his horse's hooves thundering against the rock. But Eliza was ready. She took him down with a single, clean shot. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The only sound now was the wind, carrying the dust and the faint echo of the battle. Jack looked over at Eliza, who was already moving to check the riders. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, but there was something in the way she held herself, a weariness in her stance, a crack in the armor she always wore. "You okay?" Jack asked, though he knew the answer before she gave it. "Just a scratch," she said, her tone clipped, but there was no hiding the exhaustion in her voice. She had done what she had to do, and he knew it had taken everything from her. Jack wiped the blood from his arm, the sting of the wound barely registering in his mind. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this up. They were deep in the territory now. The outlaws were ruthless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He looked over at Eliza. Her face was set in grim determination, her jaw tight. The fire in her eyes hadn't dulled, but Jack could see the weight of what they were up against. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for something more, a fight for freedom. The fight had only just begun, and Jack Harlan wasn't sure if either of them would make it out alive. But he knew one thing: whatever happened next, he was no longer alone.